to see the configuration of a very powerful rural-based, but also with articulations to urban groups, peasant movement, indigenous movement, that explodes on the national scene in the so-called Water War of Cochabamba in late 1999-2000. This is a fascinating incident. It kind of triggers a new cycle of social movements and mobilizations where we move not only through institutionalized channels of pressure and mediation, but of course outside the state as well. What's the triggering of this is, of course, the decision of the state under Bonser to sell off the municipal water system in Cochabamba. It's been written about in the New Yorker, including. So it's certainly well known by now. But what we see with the water war is the way in which social movements outside the state kind of move on and move on to the political stage and become absolutely crucial for the unfolding of events over the next 2 to 3 to 4 years, which eventually force a president out of office and bring Evo to power in December of 2005. In the last part of the paper, which apparently I don't really have all that much time to go through, what I wanted to do, and what I do, is to turn to look at how the Morales regime, how this fragile democratic order, elected into office in late 2005, is trying to confront the ethnic and regional tensions. And this is what I identify as really as very specific to Bolivia, not that they're not there elsewhere, but again, it takes far more of an acute form in Bolivia, partly because of the resurgence of ethnic mobilization in the 1990s and the kinds of unruly movements triggered by the water war in 2000. And no, I don't have any more. So what am I going to do? Well, I'm going to, I suppose, may I read the conclusion? Okay. It's in the paper. And these are the ethnic and regional, and what I'm really arguing here very basically is we're looking at the convergence of ethnic and regional schisms. It's not just the fact that Bolivia is kind of breaking up between the eastern lowlands and the western highlands being controlled by the indigenous movement, the basic regional base of MAS, and the regional lowlands representing or symbolizing the Santa Cruz capitalist entrepreneurial elite that looks to Brazil as a model of nationhood, of capitalist modernity, et cetera, et cetera. But we're looking at now the way in which those regional tensions are converging with racist and ethnic tensions, and that's what that's in the paper. So just to conclude, with a couple of observations about the promises and perils of democracy in Bolivia today. In my view, the rise of MAS, the most powerful indigenous social movement and party in Latin America, has had a largely positive impact on Bolivian democracy because it's leveraged the political influence of traditionally marginalized people and articulated an economic project of development with equity. Certainly, Bolivia's electoral democracy has been strengthened by the significant increase in voter turnout in indigenous areas over the past 5 years. It's made mistakes. It's indulged in excesses. But overall, MAS has navigated the transition from social movement to political party with relative success. How the MAS will manage to sustain good governance in this highly mobilized, extremely polarized society is the question at hand. On balance, the Morales government has accomplished notable domestic reforms, reintegrated itself on favorable terms into South American diplomatic and trading networks, demonstrated an unusual degree of political transparency. On the other hand, the new regime has not shied away from militant pro-Indian symbolism, which has frightened and alienated much of the urban elite, and indeed, as someone said the other day, much of the middle class at this point. Politically, the most intense struggle is taking place in the Constitutional Convention to so-called refound the nation. Precious months were lost in the battle over voting procedures, thus squandering the opportunity to bring the country together under the powerful electoral mandate that put Evo Morales into office in the first place. Meanwhile, long-standing tensions between regionalism and centralism have flared up, feeding fuel to the regional autonomy movement, that's on the east, the Santa Cruz movement, of the so-called Media Luna, and to the right-wing opposition. So Bolivia seems to be at a historic impasse over how to rewrite the political rules of the game, and more fundamentally, how to consolidate a centralized state committed to solving Bolivia's desperate social problems: poverty, inequality, marginality, discrimination. Symptomatic of this breakdown of unity and dialogue is a resurgence of street politics being deployed by both MAS and the opposition forces. And as a result, racial ethnic polarization is once again on the rise in both the Indian highlands and the white lowlands. And today I would argue it is the convergence of this regional ethnic schism that constitute what is the most sinister threat to Bolivia's fragile democratic order. So I hate to leave this on an apocalyptic note, because I was the symbol of optimism only about 3 or 4 or 5 months ago. But things have really gotten considerably more tense there, and I think part of the thing at play now that may determine which way it goes is the meltdown of the Constitutional Assembly. The MAS has turned to the social movements again. MAS is both a political party and in state power, but it's a social movement. It's calling that back. And of course, the mobilization and increasingly cohesive political bloc that Santa Cruz regional elites form with sectors of the middle class.
Okay. Rami.
Thank you very much. Thank you to the Woodrow Wilson Center and RTI for inviting me. I'm delighted to be here, and it's nice to be in Washington. Everybody's happy, I guess, because the Redskins won 2 games in a row, so it's nice to be in a city with a lot of people smiling. And I want to talk about Lebanon, and what I want to talk about really is not just Lebanon, but most of the Middle East, because I think Lebanon is quite representative of what's happening all around the Middle East. It's easy to get stuck in some of the details of local politics and political contestation inside Lebanon, but I think we need to accurately see it as a symbol of really wider trends that I think are going on all over the region, at least all over the Arab world. Turkey, Israel, Iran, each one is slightly different. The title there is given Lebanon's implications of failure in the public sector is easy to answer at one level, that the public sector has failed quite badly already. I mean, this public sector is effectively dysfunctional today at the level of political governance. At the level of day-to-day routine bureaucratic activities, it's functioning fine. We just bought an apartment in Beirut and went through the whole process of registering it and everything with 1,000 little bureaucratic steps, and everything was done normally. Sometimes you had to wait a month or 2 because the minister had resigned or was refusing to go to the office, and then you just wait a while and it gets done, or you find ways to speed up the process. So the system functions without an effective government, and this is really one of the great Lebanese contributions to world history, along with the alphabet, which is that you can run a country without an effective government. Somalia gave us that same lesson a few years ago. Palestine is giving it to us. It's one of the new Arab contributions to global civilization and the work of political scientists, which is how societies govern themselves without official governments in place, or the most fascinating new development which we see in Lebanon and Palestine and Sudan and Iraq and other places, is that you actually have several governments, and they're actually all legitimate. And if they're not official governments, they're at least they're legitimate governing authorities or power authorities that actually deliver services and exercise power, including significant military power, and they seem to be legitimate by their own people, and you have several of them at the same time within the same country. So a single sovereignty with multiple government authorities is one of the latest Arab contributions to global civilization. We're very proud of it. We haven't quite figured out how long it's going to last, what it really means, if it's going to continue, or if this is just a transitional stage. But I think these are some of the kinds of issues that raise themselves for us to consider when we look at Lebanon and we look at the region. The public sector governance challenges and the stresses in Lebanon reflect a whole series of different things that are happening simultaneously. There is a local power struggle between the Sinai government and the Hezbollah-led opposition, and they're vying for a different share, a different combination of power within the cabinet, a different electoral system so that they have different shares of power in parliament. So there's a very local power struggle going on. At the same time, you have a bilateral struggle going on between Syria and Lebanon, which is still a consequence of the modern history of Lebanon. And the Syrians still have not accepted the fact that Lebanon became an independent country, and part of it was taken out of Syria by the French. And so this is an old problem between the Syrians and the Lebanese. And recently Syria dominated Lebanon for many years, and some people say it occupied it, but there's a terrible, stressful situation between Lebanon and Syria. So that is still working itself out. You have a regional power struggle going on between Israel, Syria, Saudi Arabia, which manifests itself in Lebanon as well. You have a wider contest between Iran and the United States, more or less leading to constellations of forces within the Middle East and further afield who are confronting each other, and Lebanon is one of the arenas where the struggle is taking place. You have the historical weakness of a pluralistic consensus based on power sharing, a consociational democracy, as the Lebanese call it. This is a process that has been going on since the 30s and 40s, and it really has not worked very well in recent years. It worked okay up till around the 1950s or 60s, but then it started showing its weaknesses. And then finally, I think you have a problem emerging with at a much higher level, I think, of analysis, which is the very viability of statehood and the legitimacy of nationhood. And I think these are bigger sticker items, but they really need to be worked into the issues that we have to consider as we're looking at Lebanon or most of the other countries in the Arab world. At the moment, the main government institutions, the public sector institutions of government, have failed and are totally immobilized. The cabinet, it's still working, but it doesn't represent all the Lebanese. Many of its decisions are being challenged, so the cabinet is not working very well. The parliament hasn't met for months and months and months, and the National Dialogue Committee that was established last year and that met a few times to try to overcome the immobility of these other institutions, the informal national dialogue, is no longer meeting either. So the three mechanisms, the cabinet, the parliament, the national dialogue, that were very vibrant at one point and did in fact were inclusive, everybody was there, have all stopped functioning in any significant way. But at the same time, I think the good news is that the political contestation process has been largely peaceful within Lebanon. There were some explosions and assassinations, but those were presumed to be either done by external powers. Many Lebanese blame the Syrians or the Israelis or others, and who knows who's responsible. Or they were done, as is now clear, by Fatah al-Islam and some of these small Kaaba-like terror groups that are springing up, partly as a consequence of the Anglo-American adventure in Iraq, but that's a separate point for a different conference. But the proliferation of neo-terrorist groups, small terrorist groups all over the Middle East is something that's now just becoming clear, and Lebanon is probably the most dramatic arena for this in the short run, because it's the area where you've actually had a little war recently, a 3.5 month war between Fatah al-Islam and the Lebanese army in the north of Lebanon. So this is, again, a new phenomenon that we're seeing in Lebanon, which we're probably going to see other places, which is very localized wars between Arab armies, heavily funded and supported and armed by the United States, fighting against small, spontaneously emerging terror groups that ally themselves to Al-Qaeda. But that kind of violence has very specific causes, and it's separate from the political contestation within Lebanon, which has been and continues to be largely peaceful. The other good news is that there are intense mediation efforts, and I would suggest to add an item to your list of how do you grade democracies if your former colonial masters have to keep coming back as mediators to mediate among your people? You should probably lose a couple of points too. But the French foreign minister is now coming regularly to Beirut to mediate among the Lebanese. It's extraordinary. I saw Saudi envoys, Arab League envoys. There's more per capita mediation in Lebanon, I think, than any other country in the world. But this is probably a constructive sign, because it means that the Lebanese are looking to solve their political problems. And I think the situation causes us to look at the issue in a wider context and say, well, what are the problems? What is this? Is it a question of the quality of democracy, as we're talking about, or is it a wider question? And I would say that there are several simultaneous issues that we have to look at. One is that a system structured around confessional proportionality, which is what we have in Lebanon. There's 18 different religious and ethnic groups that formally have a place in the system, in parliament or in the government bureaucracy or in the cabinet or in the senior army officers or in the bureaucracy. A system structured around confessional proportionality has reached the limits of its efficacy due to several factors. One is that so many of these Lebanese groups have formal and enduring links with outside powers, military links, financial links, whatever, whether it's the Shiites with Iran or the Sunnis with Saudis or the Christians with the French or others with the Americans. This structural reliance on foreign support, funding and protection makes democracy a mockery, and we're seeing this in Lebanon. Also, the changing demographic balance in Lebanon has really brought this system more or less to the end of its useful life. The Shiites are emerging as the largest group in the country. The combination of Sunni and Shiite Muslims is now much more than the Christians. The Christians themselves have become relatively a minority in the country, and the Christians have also split politically. So Michel Aoun is allied with Hezbollah. The other Christians, most of them are allied with the government. So there's a really serious demographic shakeup taking place, which is, again, making this traditional system no longer functional. Second point, I'm going through these very quickly because of limited time. The second point is the dominance of group rights over individual rights degrades the quality of public life in any attempt to have a functioning democracy or an efficient government system. I think this is pretty clear. If the tribe dominates the citizen, you can't have a real serious democratic system. You can have a governance system based on a tribal confederacy, which is essentially what most of the Arab countries are, but you can't have a real functioning democracy. And one of the problems here is that when you have groups that define political life and identity and interests, and these groups have access to external resources, as all of them do in Lebanon, whether it's money from Iran or guns from Syria or money from the U.S. or whatever, from France or Saudis, these external resources mean that most of the key players inside Lebanon don't need a functional political system in the country. They don't need either power or validation from their own political system because they get it from outside. Therefore, they can let the state stagnate. They can let the public governance system deteriorate and stagnate and freeze up as it's doing now. The third element is that the weak central government, which Lebanon has always had, has led to, obviously, the strength that people don't want to live in a vacuum, so a weak central government means either you're going to be dominated by foreigners from outside, which Lebanon has experienced. Syria or Israel or others have dominated it, and that wasn't satisfactory. So the weak central government has to be offset by strong sectarian, ethnic, and tribal groups. So we have a situation where real power is now shared partly by the state, which still functions. It's not as if the government is not there. It's there. There's a police, there's an army, but it doesn't rule the whole country. Real power is shared by the state and by non-state actors, whom I don't think we should call them non-state actors anymore. When you have a group like Hezbollah, which is very powerful, I would call them the parallel state. So you have states and parallel state actors. Hezbollah's military capabilities are far greater than the Lebanese government's. Its service delivery capacity is far greater than the Lebanese government. But at the same time, Hezbollah doesn't want to take over the government. So it's a parallel state actor to the official state. And that raises issues of why people like Hezbollah, why groups like Hezbollah have become so strong. I think we need to look at them dispassionately, which I know in this town is very difficult to do. By the way, my beard is not a Hezbollah beard, it's a Greek Orthodox Nazareth Christian beard, but it just looks like a Hezbollah beard because my barber is a Shiite from South Lebanon. So it makes me look like a Shiite, but I'm a Greek Orthodox Christian from Palestinian from Nazareth, and therefore I look at Hezbollah rather dispassionately. I respect, admire some of the things they do, I criticize some of the things they do, but I think I look at them reasonably objectively, and I think an objective look at Hezbollah and their power forces us to examine, well, what do groups like this represent? Why is it in a country like Lebanon you can have this kind of group emerge and become so strong, or Hamas in Palestine, or other groups, Muqtada Sadr in Iraq, and there's groups like this all over the Middle East. I think it's important to look at the lessons that they represent, which are lessons in credibility, efficacy, and legitimacy, in terms of how they respond to and are accountable to their constituents. And the real question here is, how do you turn constituents into citizens? Their constituents are predominantly their own Shiite fellow citizens, but not only, because some of their services also serve other people who are not Shiites, who live in the areas where they predominate. But I would give you 8 reasons why Hezbollah is powerful, credible, and seen to be, by its own people, very effective. And these 8 reasons, I think, are important to grasp as symptomatic of the rise of these kinds of parallel state actors or non-state actors alongside the weakness of the state. And the 8 reasons why Hezbollah is important. I mean, in the U.S., of course, Hezbollah is seen predominantly as a terrorist organization. It's on the terrorist list. It's a bad guy. The reality from the ground is very different. The reality is that Hezbollah is credible and powerful and effective. First of all, because it successfully fought the Israeli occupation of South Lebanon and drove the Israelis out of most of South Lebanon. Second of all, it represents a very powerful reassertion of Shiite identity and a fight for Shiite citizen rights after the years and years of marginalization and discrimination. Third of all, they are part of a broad pan-Islamic revival all across the Middle East. Fourth of all, they support the Palestinian cause, generally speaking, which is a very resonant cause with people all over the Arab world and much of the rest of the world. Fifth of all, they deliver key social services and other needs to their constituents, medical care, vocational training, unemployment. Now they're doing reconstruction of destroyed areas from the war. Sixth of all, they fight corruption and inefficiency, and they provide a model of non-corrupt, efficient service delivery. Seventh of all, they promote a sense of pan-Arab sentiment. They mix their Islamism with their Lebanese identity, with the pan-Arab identity, in a very powerful combination that appeals to a lot of people, because the pan-Arab sentiment is still there at some level. And number 8, which is the most recent manifestation of the role they play, is that they present themselves as one of the actors in the region that is resisting American hegemonic aims. And those are their words, not mine, but that's how they present themselves, and that's how a lot of people see them. Now, those are issues that I think are important to note as reasons why Hezbollah is so strong, and those are functions that you'd think the state should be carrying out, but it doesn't always do that. So I think I'll close by saying that if we're looking at this kind of context with all of these issues that I quickly tried to highlight, I think we have to ask ourselves, can we assess the quality and the depth of democracy in a place like Lebanon, or should we really be assessing the role of democracy as a valued condition or a goal for the Lebanese people or the Arab people vis-a-vis other goals of governance and communal life? Is it a question of is democracy working, or is it a question of other things as well? And I would say that, in fact, we should talk about other things as well, because it's you cannot democracy and measure it or assess it in the absence of the other issues. And the other issues are, again, big sticker items. We're talking of legitimacy. We're talking of efficacy of governance systems. We're talking of basic sovereignty. Issues of fundamental sovereignty, of people in control of their lives and territory, and their big issues of to reflect your identity, your individual, your communal, your national, and Arab, your pan-Islamic identity. Issues that concern every day more than democracy. Issues of nationalism. Does your country make sense? Issues of stability and security, basic day-to-day stability and security. And survival, and finally issues of religion versus secularism. These are really big, every one of these is a big sticker item, and collectively they form that constellation of ordinary Arabs and Lebanese and deal with every day far more than they do with democracy as a major issue that they're looking at. Say that the real issues we're looking at is a question of self-validation and citizenries that have to validate themselves as countries and as had a single Arab citizenry or population. We had the opportunity to define itself in terms of its own governance system, its own government officials, powers, foreign powers, its internal. We're still in most of the slight exaggeration, but as a newspaper columnist, I'm not a scholar, I can do that. It's a slight exaggeration, but I think it's true to say that my children are addressing fundamentally the same issues that my grandparents addressed at the end of World War I. We've gone through a century without any significant change in addressing the fundamental public governance issues and identity and nationalism issues in most of the Arab countries. Issues of secularism versus religiosity, relations between Zionism and Arabism, relations between the Arab world and Western powers, the relationship of a citizen to the state, the power of the central government, checks and balances on central authority, the role of the military services. The most fundamental issues of citizenship and statehood have not been fundamentally either studied or addressed or responded to, decided by the citizens of the Arab countries themselves. And so we're seeing all these stresses all over the region. We're still seeing foreign armies coming into the region. We're still seeing Israeli occupation of Arab lands 40 years later. We're still seeing Arab regimes where fathers pass power to their sons and people stay in power over 30 and 40 years. And they do so now with democratic elections. So Hosni Mubarak and Zayd al-Abidin bin Ali and Ali Abdullah Saleh are the leaders of political parties that have elections and seats in parliament. They're now democratically elected leaders, but most of the time democratically elected for life and in perpetuity. And people don't want to put up with this very much, so this is why you're seeing these Islamist movements and some of these other movements coming up. So I've run out of time, I think, but I just finished by saying that we need democracy in the Middle East. I think people want democratic systems. They want good governance. They want accountability. They want justice and equality and fair play. The World Value Surveys that have analyzed Pippin Norris and others have done analyses between Western countries, the United States and Arab Islamic countries, looking at the World Value Survey, showing that the convergence of commitment to values of equality, of good governance, of justice, the rule of law are almost identical between the Arab Islamic world and the United States. So it's not a question of values. I think that's the problem. The question is the exercise of political power. And therefore, I think it's probably correct to say that before looking much more deeply at issues of democracy in the Arab world or Lebanon, I think we really have to go back to the basics and look at the issues of self-determination and whether these citizenries can in fact be given an opportunity for the first time to actually decide questions of their own identity and governance and political systems. Thank you.
Okay, thanks to all the panelists for, I think, some very rich comments on a diverse set of issues related to democratization. I know we're a little over time, but I think it's worth giving maybe a few minutes to some questions from the floor. So I'll take a few questions. Yes, in the blue shirt there. Yeah, it's coming here.
Hi, I'm Scott Radnitz. I'm a fellow here at the Wilson Center. I think both Larry Goodson and Rami Khoury did a good job of taking the question that they were posed and judging by how absurd that was to the situations that you're dealing with. You did a respectful job of answering that question about democracy as best you could, which then leads to my question about the large number of weak or failing states in the world where, as Rami Khoury mentioned, democracy isn't the number one issue, and there are much more fundamental questions that have to be answered in order for these countries even to function. Are panels like this and political discourse about democracy, right, as the overriding imperative, are these diverting resources into the wrong places? Are they distracting us from more fundamental issues which we may be able to direct our foreign policy apparatus to solve? And how do you go about trying to redirect, right, the way the questions that are asked in order to solve these more fundamental issues?
Okay, thanks. And anybody else? All right, let's just go with that one then. Larry, do you want to take a first shot?
Sure, I'll take the first shot at that. After the events of 9/11, when I was called in, before I formally joined the government and set everything on the record, I was asked what we should do in Afghanistan, and as my remarks today suggested, I said we should build roads. We should build stuff, because Afghanistan is lacking lots of stuff that they used to have, and we are terrible at nation building, at building institutions, because for two reasons, it seemed to me, and it still seems to me after working with the military and our foreign policy apparatus in the last several years, we're not terribly culturally sophisticated about other countries, so that when we go off to Afghanistan to design electoral systems and governments, or Iraq to do the same sort of thing, we entrust this to people who don't speak the local language, who don't spend time with the local people, and who don't know very much about all the local power, entities that are there. And secondly, as we're seeing right now, I mean, in the last week or so with Dave Petraeus and Ryan Crocker coming to Washington, we have a limited sort of stomach for this kind of sausage making, and consequently, the admonition that I was sort of giving in my remarks, that if you're going to do a democratic transition and try to foster it from abroad, you've got to be prepared. In one of these places like Afghanistan, you've got to be prepared to stay for a very long time. One of the problems we have in Afghanistan, and I'm just going to inject a very quick Pakistani note here since no one has asked me about Pakistan. There's a guy named Musharraf there. He's a bigger dictator than my friend here. But anyway, whenever you go to Pakistan, the first thing that the Pakistani diplomats, generals, or whoever will always tell you is, "Oh, you Americans, you're going to leave us. You've left us 4 times. You've left us 5 times." I'm always sort of calculating, no, it's 3 times, but that's not really a good answer. And that is the mindset throughout the Arab world, vis-a-vis Iraq, I think, and throughout, the parts a bit to the east, vis-a-vis Afghanistan and Pakistan. So I think these are limitations on our ability to do that. Hence my belief that we should have focused in Afghanistan. We shouldn't have gone to Iraq. That's a different issue. But with regard to Afghanistan, we should have focused on building infrastructure and economic development, and then come behind that with the kind of political institution building. That was my recommendation, would have been today as well.
Rami.
Yeah, I think if you're going to promote democracy, you should do it democratically. That's my message to the United States government, which is, by all means, promote democracy. But do it in a democratic, consultative process, accountable process with the people of the region. I think if the United States sat with people in the region and talked to them about jointly creating a democratic transition, I think most people in the Arab world would be very happy to do that. And I think the United States should start with democratically elected people like Hamas and others who it refuses to talk to. If the United States is unable to deal democratically with the Arab world because of its linkages with Israel and its commitments to Israel, it should also come out and say that very clearly. Because we're beyond the point of playing games, and I think the lesson we're getting out of the Arab world, and much of the rest of the world, is that people are not going to sit around and watch this stuff on CNN anymore, or even watch it in Arabic Al Jazeera. What you have now is a very powerful movement of defiance and resistance all across the region. People are fighting back. They're not afraid of the United States or Israel or their own governments. I mean, I'm not saying this I'm just giving a description of the region, and this may be a suicidal approach that people in the region are using, but this is the reality of what we see. If you look at last summer's war with Hezbollah fighting Israel for 34 days and forcing it to accept the UN ceasefire, this is unprecedented with tremendous support all around the Arab world. This is not a happy scenario for the future, neither for Israel nor for the Arab countries. And I was sitting there in Beirut with missiles going over my head. It wasn't a very nice thing to watch. But it's a sign of the future. And people are not going to sit around anymore and just put up with neo-colonial double standards, which is how they see the American approach to democracy. So I think people in the Middle East want to be democratic, but they want to be sovereign before that. They want to live in dignity. They want to be treated as human beings. They want to be truly independent. They want to express their identities. And the U.S. should tap into that. There's a massive constituency for the things the United States is selling. If the United States were selling it consistently, and the same goes for the Europeans and the British and everybody else. So I think that democracy promotion is a good thing, but it needs to be done more democratically and more consistently across the board.
Good. Okay, let's take one more and then we'll break for the reception. Aaron?
Thanks, Aaron. Aaron Williams with RTI. Mr. Curry, to follow up on your comment, let me just ask you a question. If you were advising the presidential candidate, let's step away from this administration, what would be the single most important symbolic act that you would advise them to consider in the first 100 days of their new administration in order to send a signal to the Arab world that, in fact, the United States is prepared to change its thinking and its policies in the Middle East? What would be your best recommendation?
Well, we're actually doing that now. Institute at AUB, American University Beirut, is working on a program with an American university, which must remain unnamed for the moment because it's not public yet. We're going to put together American Arab teams to come up with a white paper for the American presidential candidates. So we hope to present them here in Washington. So we're actually going to do something like that. But what I would say, speaking on my own, I think the most important thing that the United States can do is to speak to all the people in the Arab world in an inclusive manner. And what it should do is should replicate what it did in Northern Ireland in the Arab world. It should send an envoy, and it doesn't have to be George Mitchell, but he would be fine, but it send an envoy, a serious person, and have a meeting of all the people in the Arab world. Keep out people like Bin Laden and Qaeda, that's no problem, excluding them. But all other legitimate, democratically elected, credible actors, Israelis, Arabs, Iranians, Turks, must be brought into the process on the basis of nonviolent solutions to the problems. If the United States were to take that lead, it would be incredibly powerful. So I think that would be the single most symbolic thing it could do, an inclusive gathering of all legitimate, credible leaders and people and groups in the Middle East.
Okay, it's been a long but I think extremely interesting day, and we want to invite you all to stay for the reception and have a little bit more discussion with our panelists. Before we close, though, let me ask you to join me in thanking, I think, what's been a really, really interesting set of presentations this afternoon. And as several people said, the papers that people said they didn't have time to present in full are going to be posted on the RTI and the Woodrow Wilson website in the near future. So you will have access to what was not presented here or was glossed over quickly. Thank you.
Sorry for calling you a dictator. That was a democracy joke. You know? I don't really think of you as a charm-like person. White or anything like that. I enjoyed that presentation, even though we were all... I was